Hey, today we're going to talk about the Cat in the Hat and Dr. Sparky Sweet's Thug Notes analysis and interpretation of it. So I like to use this because he really actually does a good analysis of it, and he's really reporting in his when he does his videos, he's really doing the analysis well. But he's also showing, here's what a lot of different ways that people interpret things, and so it's a good way for us to kind of look at that and say, well, how do I do that? And one of the first things I want to say is he does give a summary. Okay, we don't give a summary. Don't give a summary in your college papers unless you're explicitly asked to. Here, we're not summarizing, but it's one of the biggest kind of pitfalls is to just retell the story. We want to go deeper. We want to get to interpretation and evaluation and interpretation and what do you think, right? What does this mean? What does this show us? That reading between the lines. So while you may have a sentence or two that kind of sums it up, that's okay. Summary. No, 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 no. So no, it's great that he does that because that keeps everybody, whether you've read it or seen it or whatever, on the same page. So first of all, he does good summary, but don't do it. But you have to read it. I mean, it also shows how you have to be familiar with the parts before you can do the analysis. So because analysis does require looking at those parts. You've got to find the meaning between the lines. What are the implications and similarities? So we do a lot of looking, and I know as an English major, my degree's in rhetoric and composition, so it is about analysis, but the focus is more on everything from literature to just essays, nonfiction, that kind of thing. But I know sometimes in literature classes I kind of felt like this is just bullshit, like I was just making this up. Sometimes, right? It is a brain exercise. It really is. But it's also an exercise that we do in life. I mean, when someone says something to you and you have to decide how did they mean it, sarcastic or funny or friendly or mean. When somebody says, I love the word dude. It could be anything. It could be dude, dude, dude. Dude, I mean, like inflection is everything, right? And so there's this one word, this thing that is stable, D-U-D-E. I mean, it's spelled the same, everything like that. And all of a sudden that inflection, that tone changes and gives it a different meaning. And you have to read that through your understanding of tone. Same thing with words. And when we send words out there and we read stories, we read other people's words, what are they saying? And same thing with symbols. What's really happening here is we're also learning to read symbolically. Same thing with symbols. And we see in the media, we see, throughout, we're so filled and surrounded by visuals and everything, so many symbols that carry meaning and that say things, that imply things. And so this is one way of learning to kind of deconstruct those and say, what do these mean and what do they show us and what do they say about us? What do they say about our world? What do they say about different ways of being? And that's really at the heart of literary analysis. So keep that in mind as you think about the analysis. It is what are they saying, in the same way somebody may say dude and you have to decide on tone, what do they mean by it, right? They're saying, there's the events, there's what people say, and then there's the meaning. So that's kind of one level. And so that's where we're going. I got lost. Let me move on. One of the things he does in his analysis is he does compare the author and the character of the cat. However, we have to be careful with that, and that's something we have to use research for. And he gives it, he kind of shows some pictures, but there is clearly research behind that. And we could look at the Cat in the Hat. We could do a lengthy paper about the Cat in the Hat and look at Geisel's life, Dr. Seuss's life, and say, okay, how do these things go together? What are other things he's written, outside of his children's works, and what do they say? So you have to be careful just to say it's always a kind of equals thing. You have to make sure you've got some backing on that. However, that's not going to really play into anything we're writing in this class, so you're okay there. But he does look at how, that background on Seuss gave him some ideas about, he says, look, he was a real revolutionary or kind of fought against the status quo. And when you look at that, you can see that, it's his philosophy, it's his message, kind of what's that philosophy behind the book. So he definitely points toward that. And of course he quotes, and And he quotes, should we tell her about that? Now, what should we do? What would you do if your mother asked you? And so he's really pointing toward the narrator. He says the narrator acts like there's a difference between what he should do and what he's gonna do. He notices, so Dr. Sweets notices this characteristic or trait. Who is this cat? What is this person like? This is really key. When you read literature and you encounter characters, you want to think about them, and when you write about them, or when you're starting in your head by doing that interpretation and the so what, I have to write a paper, what the hell do I write? Think about the characters, right? And think about describing them, and imagine talking to somebody and saying, I met this person last night. What would you say they were like? Were they honest? Were they mean? Were they this? Were they that? And when you start coming up with those words of here's what they're like, then you ask yourself, what did I read in the story that made me think that? Right? And here this is a good example of, this difference between what I should do and what I'm going to do. And that's really key in terms of that, because that tells us something about the person's internal character, their real traits. Because one of the things we can always talk about with literature is, what does this show us about what it's like to be human? And we can always talk about that. What does this show about the human condition, of where we're at, those kinds of things. I've never been a soldier, and I was never a soldier in World War II. But I can watch Band of Brothers, and I don't know exactly what it's like, but I can get a feeling for it. I've never been a Scottish junkie. Hallelujah. But I can watch Train Spotting, and I can get a feeling for it. So much of literature, there are sometimes, if you've ever listened to a song and thought, man, that's me, that's my life, I get that. That's that connection. So that's what literature does for us on one hand, but it also only does that when we look for it and when we seek it. With a song, we're used to listening to songs, and we do listen. If you've ever listened to songs, we listen to them in different ways. And I think there's something about like singing them that we are putting those words out. And so we hear some of those more subtle meanings. And we know and we accept that, if somebody says that, you're like a walk in the sunshine, they don't mean you are exactly like a walk in the sunshine. It's this feeling, it's this sensory. So we're reading between the lines. So I think we do that a lot better with music. But it's the same thing here. We just have to stop and say, okay, what's this person like? Or, yeah, this situation may be different. This may be Scotland, and these guys may be junkies. But does this relate to some other obsession? Does this relate to, being so caught up in some situation? Are there similarities? Do we learn something about what it's like to be human in this moment? Whether we understand it or not, it is learning about humanity. So that's kind of the key in terms of thinking about how do you think about this in small terms of character, or, what's a situation like? Is it similar in those ways? But also in terms of things like, the overall, the big picture. Okay, now we got to give him his citation props. You notice he's just talking about one source. So once he mentions Dr. Seuss, he's mentioned that author, and this is MLA, author location. So once he's mentioned that author in his video here, if we were writing a paper, that one author, if we're only using that one source, all we need is that location. And so there he's got the parentheses and 61. That is the page from whatever version he used. So props to Dr. Sweets. Another thing he does when we think about this character is he identifies the roles characters play or represent. So the cat in the hat equals subversion. The fish could be society's norms, a conservative nature, religion. Could it also be, one of the things that I always see, and he didn't mention this, is that it's like the older generation. Like the fish is like the one, you kids are always doing this and you're doing that and you can't do that and you shouldn't do that. And, in every generation, you go back and read the freaking Greeks, and literally they have quotes in the Greeks that sound like they were from yesterday about the current, younger generation. So everybody's complained in the same way about younger generations. So that fish for me always represents that in a way. And that's one of the really cool things to think about. everybody has different interpretations. You can see it different ways, and it doesn't mean they're all right. It doesn't mean they're all wrong. There's a whole lot of rightness in the middle of all this, right? There are some wrong ones. To say the cat, you know, grew wings and flew away, there's no evidence for that. Maybe the cat in the hat does have wings. I don't know. You don't know, just based on reading that book. And so we can only use from the start of a story to the end of it as our evidence. We can't do this speculation. That's fun. That's interesting. But we've got to stay within the pages of whatever it is we're reading for our evidence, in this case when we're just using one source. And so the point is you can see how he kind of makes those equations. Now, do you have to believe it all? I don't know. It's a mind game. It's a mind exercise. The more you're able to do this, the more you're able to decide when someone says to you, dude, what do they mean? Do they mean dude, 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 dude? It is about, at the same time, it's about learning those things. So I want you to think of it kind of like a game. And you may read those and see those things in it, and that's cool. Like I said, sometimes I do. And then sometimes I'm like, I'm just making up bullshit. But you need to make up logical bullshit, okay? And that's the key thing. You've got to back it with evidence. And so that's what happens here in each of these cases where he says, oh, some people see it this way or some people see it that way. He gives us examples. And so he is basically quoting, in many places he does quote from the book, but those examples are paraphrases quoting from the book. So he is using that evidence to show how people arrive at the interpretation. And that is also very key. In this, how do you develop your paper long enough? Well, you get to use somebody else's words. You use their quotes. You quote properly. But if you just quote it, I read the story. Your teachers have read the articles. They're going to say, yeah, my whole family, we've seen Star Trek. We've seen Star Wars. You tell us what happened in one of them. We're like, yeah, so what, right? And that interpretation, that is your so what. That's the part you want to get to. So when you give a quote, you say, ask yourself, so what? What does this mean? What does this show me? What is this like? Is there some point here? And that's where you go with that. So you've got to have, in terms of doing that analysis, you look at the evidence. Here's what it says, and you have to learn how to look. And I think that's what these these Thug Note videos are good at, is they show you how to look at things. So I advise, go watch a bunch of them. They're hilarious. I think he's funny. So you learn how to look for evidence, but then you also learn how to interpret it. And what do you say? What do you point out? Now, he also draws conclusions. So your conclusions, your evidence is, here's this in the story, and I think it means this, or it shows this, or it symbolizes this, or it represents this. That conclusion is not just because at the end. That's not what it means. It means I conclude this. I have looked at all this, and this is the big idea. And so that conclusion should be bigger than your individual points. And so he says, maybe it's symbolizing that society is going to fall to shit if we keep trying to keep things too tied up. Or maybe it's trying to tell us that once in a while we got to forget the rules, get a little crunk, and let that beastie side rage, because if we don't, then shit really going to fall apart. Those are kind of messages, morals, overall themes. In talking about that in the conclusion, of course, you develop it more than that. Why do we need that? We live in this society. It makes sense, right? We live in this society. You think about Dr. Seuss's society, even though it's longer ago, it's still the, industrial society, emergence of technology. We live in a country, the United States has very much always been focused on work and doing a job, and that work ethic, and don't be lazy, and all of those kinds of things. And so, that's one of the kind of cultural messages that we live with a lot. So, do we need to cut loose once in a while, right? Do we need to do those things? And those are the kinds of things we could talk about. All of those things I mentioned represent bigger society. Now, again, that's just me. That's what I'm thinking about this right now. Ask me tomorrow, my mind may change. It may be different, okay? That's my interpretation in the right here and now. Is it okay if you have a different interpretation? Yeah, that is your interpretation. Can you look at the story and say, well, look, when I read this, or with the cat in the hat, these pictures show, mean, do that kind of thing. We do have to be careful not to fall off the far end and really take it too far where it's just kind of crazy. Okay, we've got to be able to draw logical conclusions between those things. So overall, you want to, first of all, remember you don't have to start with the thesis. Sometimes looking at the evidence and drawing conclusions about small parts helps you figure out what you think. So you never have to start an essay at the first unless you're writing in class, and there are even ways around that. But if you just look at your evidence, you're like, you know what? Let me look at this character, who this person is, what they represent, what they're showing, what they're saying about the modern world or back in the day or whatever it is. Let me look at this idea, this way this thing's treated, and look at those. And you just look at those parts in the story and put those together and say, what do I think? What does this show me? What is this saying? If you isolate those from the rest of the words in the story, that often helps a lot to draw your interpretation and especially your bigger conclusion. So the process for doing this is really to, look at those bits of evidence to decide what you think, what's your answer to the question. That always equals your thesis. If you give yourself a question, and here you are going to be given questions, choose one and answer one, which is very common in college classes. So you need lots of practice for that. And then to discuss and interpret it, to say so what, and then draw that big conclusion. Think about what it means in the bigger picture of things. What is it saying about that time, about now, about us, about, I don't know, skiers on hillsides. I'm not sure if I thought of skiers, but, if you're reading a story about them, what does it say? So overall, that's kind of the connections, and those are kind of basic ideas I want you to carry with you as we look at stories and literary analysis, and indeed, not just of literature, but analysis in general. Cool beans?